This meeting is being recorded.
Dr. Amber Harris is here today with us to talk about RTI, which is response to intervention. Dr. Harris is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Louisiana Monroe, which is my husband's alma mater. Go Warhawks. And she also is a contractor for Monroe City Schools as a school psychologist. Besides all that and a lot of other positions that she holds in the community, she's the mom of a dazzling young man with autism. So she pretty much has experienced, I think, just about everything when it comes to school or disability. So Dr. Harris, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. And thank you to Families Helping Families for facilitating workshops like this, because I know as an educator and also as somebody who has sat on the parent side of the conference table, the IEP table, we use a lot of lingo. It's kind of like breaking off into your own little society that has its own rules, when it comes to special education and getting services. So it is important that you do these webinars and things for parents to help them understand so they can best advocate. And I just really appreciate what Families Helping Families does. So I feel very honored to be asked to be one of the presenters and do my small part to promote that education for parents so that parents can be their child's best advocate. So thank you for doing that. Like Sharon mentioned, I am a school psychologist. I also serve on the state board for the Louisiana School Psychology Association. I'm also on the national board for the National Association of School Psychologists. And right here in North Louisiana, I helped found the Autism Society local chapter here because I did that when my son, he's now 16, and it was in his teen years. And it was me and a group of parents who thought, what are the things that we wish we had when we were starting out on this journey, trying to understand? And so that's kind of what we've turned that into is trying to be a resource and support. But most importantly, with all my titles, I am a mom to a young man named Garrison, who has autism. So I do speak, sometimes I speak on this, and also sometimes I speak to professionals. Actually, I just on last Thursday, as a matter of fact, I was at the state association's conference speaking to school psychologists about how they can better treat and work with the families of individuals with disabilities, and just trying to share that perspective of what it's like being a parent, and people talking in alphabet soup with all of these abbreviations and things like that, and not really realizing that, if you don't live in this world, or you're a parent that's newly embarking in this world, you may not understand those things, and just kind of some of the things that a parent goes through whenever they're learning about their child's disability or advocating to get their child services. So hopefully that helped, and hopefully you'll see the impact of that in IEP meetings you attend in the future with Louisiana School Psychologist. So why do we have RTI? Like Sharon mentioned, RTI stands for Response to Intervention. The way that our U.S. school system was designed, it was designed to sort students into tracks, just to be honest, into different areas of where they should go to get their needs met and get the best available education. The majority of our students that do have to go into special education are because of a reading disability. That is, that actually in speech language impairment are your two big categories, but most of them that are getting referred for initially, whether they qualify for some other disability or not, they're being referred because of reading. Reading is a big deal. If you followed anything in education and media, you know how big the science of reading, things like that, are right now. General education teachers need more tools than to refer to the special education teacher. That's another reason that we need RTI. RTI is not a function of special education. This is actually things that should start, at the very least, start in general education. These are things that are every teacher, I teach here at ULM, as Sharon mentioned, and the teachers coming out of this program, they need to learn, what RTI is, what interventions can be done to fix some of these common learning problems, and they have to own that. It's not just, well, this one's not learning, so he needs to go to Miss Smith's room because she handles the ones that have reading disability. When we know when we all take ownership over it, our kids are going to do so much better anyways. So RTI came about because of that faulty thinking that our kids just, if they're struggling, that they need to go to someone else because general education doesn't handle that. And I use air quotes as I say that. The national redesignation rate for special education students is currently right now at 1.8%. So getting redesignated as a different disability is what we're talking about with that. So why are we not doing a better job in helping these kids get what they need so that maybe they lose their disability status in some cases, or they get the help that they need a little bit faster? I hope that I can answer some of those questions today. So what is RTI? RTI, this little buzzword, people think of it like it's a curriculum. You might even, when you sit in a meeting as a parent, they might say, oh yeah, we do the XYZ computer program for our kids that aren't learning math. And it gives this idea that it's some sort of packaged curriculum, and it's not. RTI is really part of a framework of interventions, of giving kids what they need. It's just one part of it. That framework is called MTSS, Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. And the how they respond to the interventions is just one piece of it. And it's not one set curriculum. It's not one set computer program that's going to work on their math skills or help them learn their sight words. It's not one set exercise that some teacher pulls them out and does with them for 15 minutes a day. It is looking at data and determining where are they at and meeting the students where they're at. It's identifying those that do have special needs to learn and intervening early as possible, not delaying interventions. And it's focusing too on the quality core instruction that everybody gets. RTI starts with the instruction that's going on every single day in the classroom. As a person, as a school psychologist that would come in and work with teachers in determining maybe if a child was one person of that committee that determines maybe if a child needs to be referred, one of the first things that we look at is, well, let's look at class-wide data. And, for example, if you have over half the class that is struggling with the same kind of reading problems, is it a problem for this child, or is it a problem with your core instruction, with what you're doing in the classroom every single day for everybody? Maybe that needs to change so that more kids can be successful, not just this one or two that's getting referred for whatever reason. That's part of that RTI process, is looking at what is going on for all. And using evidence-based practices. Now, I'm not going to ding teachers too much. I know that they're really busy. A lot of them don't get planning hours. They are overworked and they are underpaid, just being honest. But, because you are overworked and underpaid, sometimes there's that tendency of, I need a lesson on teaching this phonics skill. I'm going to go to Teachers Pay Teachers and download something because I don't have time to invent something. Well, that strategy that they're using to teach it, is it really an evidence-based practice? That's a very important question for a parent to ask and to understand what that means. When we say evidence-based practice, that means that there is some evidence in the research that says this particular strategy, or if they're using a program, like for example, if it's a computer program, is that program research-based? Is there evidence in the research to say that it is appropriate for my child at their grade level on the population, on the students that you're using it for, is there evidence to say that it really is effective for remediating or teaching this skill? And because not all practices in education are research based, we have a big gap between what the research says is effective and what actually gets done in the classroom. So looking at ways to make instruction more efficient, not necessarily more taxing on the teacher, but working smarter, and that there's enough research out there behind the strategies, the different strategies that you can use for various learning issues. There's enough research out there to make this a reality. RTI needs to benefit all students. It should raise the floor and it should raise the ceiling. So even if for our kids that they are accelerated in a subject area, RTI should reveal that, and those students may need to get enrichment. They may need to be pushed on and get above level learning. So it's really, truly, when it's implemented the right way, it's not just about those struggling learners. It is about meeting them where they are at, whether that's up high, that's down low, that's somewhere in the middle, and identifying those kids. One of the ways that maybe a kid gets into the RTI process or that intervention process is through screening. Many of you sitting here listening to this, you probably heard your teachers say something about, Dibble scores or their Ames Web score. Those are some common ones that they do benchmark screening maybe a few times a year. This is common. Think about this in the medical model. Every time you go to the doctor, whether you're there for your blood pressure or not, your doctor takes your blood pressure, right? And that's a screening. That's a regular screening because you're trying to catch an indicator of some kind of health issue by screening your blood pressure. Well, it's the same way when we do those benchmark screenings in schools, we're trying to catch if there is some kind of issue. And again, we're also, in this case, we're trying to catch if maybe they need to be pushed even further and they need to get enrichment because it's meeting them wherever they fall on that skill level. So what does it look like? Well, most kids are going to fall in tier 1. They're going to respond to what we call tier 1. That is the curriculum that everybody else is getting. They're going to learn just fine with just getting that tier 1 core curriculum support in reading, math across all the subjects. A small few may need a little something extra. So in tier 1, the rule of thumb, different research will tell you different amounts, but in a well-run school where they have good core curriculum that's being taught, about 80% of kids are going to fall in that first category where they're not really going to need anything more than what everybody else is getting. And then about 10 to 15-ish, I like the technical term ish to describe stats, but about 10 to 15-ish students, 10 to 15% students, they're going to need maybe a little something extra. It might be some small group interventions that just that handful can be pulled aside. They might need more what we call drill and practice. They might need some reteaching. Where we go back and we fill in some skill gaps that they didn't get in the previous grade to help them, to scaffold their learning, to help their learning build upon itself. Whatever it is, they just need some, usually what we call low intensity, so some brief interventions to help remediate and get them caught up. Tier 3, and then this is any given school, no matter how good the curriculum is, you're going to have about 5 to 10%-ish of students that are going to need something that is more individualized, that is more intensive. Maybe it's longer time that is invested in that intervention. It's just a more detailed, intensive intervention so that they can make progress. And it is important to note because a lot of people, because reading is that common thing that people get referred for. So we think that RTI is just about academics, and it's not. RTI is also about behavior. It can be about mental health. If their behavior or their mental health is interfering with their ability to access the curriculum, to access instruction, to be able to stay in class or focus in class, whatever that behavior might be. If it's having an educational impact, meaning an impact on their ability to learn and fully participate in the learning process, then that also is something that can fall underneath RTI. So it's not just about reading, writing, and arithmetic. It can be about behavior and mental health as well. And while we do talk about handling these things in school, there is a component of this where you may involve the community providers as well, if that's what's going to work best, or that's going to be an evidence-based strategy to support that child's learning. And you always, there should be an expectation that the family is involved in the RTI process, whether that is contributing and maybe doing some extra practice things, or maybe working with the school on some behavioral strategies and supporting those strategies, whatever those interventions are. And at the very minimum, we're going to talk about families should be aware. If nothing else, they should be aware of what is happening to their child. So what is response to intervention? The big three components of it. Data. RTI is just a way of systematically looking at data to figure out why is a kid struggling. I use reading a lot as an example, but I'll give you a reading example. I'll give you a behavior example. When we're looking at this data, maybe we're looking at the school-wide screenings that they do for reading. And for example, DIBELS is a common one that you might be aware of, because every school in the state uses DIBELS for K through third grade. And it's not just like, okay, we'll read this passage and that is what it is. It's actually broken down into the different components of reading. Like it will look at sight word. It will look at reading in context, like reading a paragraph for some grades. It will also look at phonics. So it'll break down and look at that kid's ability to sound out words, also to segment words or put compound words together. It looks at all of these different aspects of reading. So when we do those screenings, we're not just saying, well, they can't read. That we're saying here they're having trouble with their reading, and here's why. This is where the breakdown is. They have good phonics skills, but maybe whenever they're having to read words in context, like in a sentence or a paragraph, that's where they're struggling. Or maybe it's that they don't have the phonological skills to read in the first place. So we know where the breakdown is, or we have an idea of where the breakdown is in their reading. With behavior, we might collect data and measure aspects of the student's behavior across all of their settings throughout the day. I did a lot of behavior intervention plans with middle school students. It's always middle school. And for example, let's say they have 7 class periods and we collect data across all 7 class periods. And it seems like the big behaviors are happening every day in math. Well, now we can use that data to drill down and say, okay, what is different about this environment where this behavior is happening here, but it's not happening everywhere else? So that data is not just used to say, Houston, we have a problem, but hopefully it's good data that's showing why we have a problem. So once we have that data and we look at that, we can engage in problem solving. If you've been to a meeting for your child, either an IEP meeting or what we call in Louisiana an SBLC, school building level committee meeting, that's actually what we're engaging in, is engaging in active problem solving. Why are they having this difficulty? What is the goal? Like, for example, if it's reading and they're in 2nd grade, how many words should they be able to read per minute? How many sounds, nonsense words or difficult to read words, how many of those should they be able to read in a minute? Things like that. So we're going to set goals around, this is where they're at, but this is where they need to be for their grade level, for their developmental level. And then you also engage in problem solving to figure out what kind of strategies do they need to get there, and how are we going to know when they have arrived, when they have achieved that goal, and figuring out the strategies. That's the key one, where as parents, you can advocate and say, when they're suggesting strategies, I'd ask that question, is what you're suggesting, is it evidence-based? Is this what the research says to help my child who is in 3rd grade? Is there research saying this program, that you're wanting to use for her age, for this skill area, because now we know why she's not reading. Is this program evidence-based to target this age and that skill? It's okay to ask that question. RTI, like I said, it's part of a framework, and it's also part of that instruction and the intervention piece. So we've identified who needs it. We have engaged in problem solving, and we have, figured out what we're going to do and where we need to take them, what level we need to take them to. And then we're actually going to implement and do the things that we said we're going to do. We're going to provide that instruction for these students and then make adjustments. And that is the part where RTI often frustrates people, because even if RTI is not quite working to move a kid in the direction that they need to go, maybe they're making some progress, but they're not making it at the rate that we had hoped for them to reach the goal, right? Like I used reading as an example. How many words per minute? We want them reading, 90 words per minute at the end of this grade level. Well, maybe they went from reading 20 words to 35 words. Well, that's some progress, but they're still not quite there. Sometimes whenever we're giving the instruction, we're providing the intervention, we look at that and we make adjustments. So, okay, they're progressing really well with this intervention, but not quite at the rate that we want. Maybe we need to add, they're only getting it 3 times a week, for example. Maybe we want to do it 5 days a week because it's making a difference, but not at the rate we need. That's a kind of an adjustment that we would do. Or maybe this is helping, but let's add this other strategy into the mix as well to maybe make it help a little faster. So that's what we're talking about with adjustments. Well, because you're going through that data review process and making adjustments as the team determines is what's best for the child to continue or to increase the progress that they're making. Sometimes it does take longer than we want it to take. I'm going to talk about that at the end. So I'm actually going to give you a tool for advocacy about that. So you think of it as this continual process when we talk about the big 3 of what is RTI, looking at data, problem solving, intervention. And you really have to think of it as a cycle. And that cycle happens over and over until we find exactly what the problem is and we solve it. Notice data is at the top. And this is probably the biggest change when it comes to doing RTI. Data becomes the center of what we look at. Everything needs to be data driven. And then you engage maybe with new data, you engage in new problem solving, you adjust, you might do a new intervention or a change to the intervention. Then you collect the data again and determine how is that working. Okay. Garrison, my son that Sharon mentioned, he loves to play with my PowerPoints. And I think that he has added animation on my slides because, just in full disclosure, this was not there before. And I would love to say this is the first time that he's done this when I've left PowerPoints open on my computer, but it is not. About a year ago, I presented for the State Department on recovery after COVID, and I was shocked when I got in there to find that he had added all kinds of beautiful animations. So as we're going through these slides and you see different animations or pieces popping in at different times, I am just as surprised as you are at how this is coming about, just so you know. He is a character, and he is a joy for people that get to meet him. So tier 1, who are our students? What do they need? How can I help them when they struggle? Tier 2, why are some still struggling? What other skills do they need? So what other things can we do? Those are those small group or low intensity, just some added intervention. And then tier 3, how do I target those needs even more? Because these lower level or lower intensity interventions are not working. So all the way when we're going through this, we're questioning, did it work? No. All right, what do we need to do differently? So that's where that progress monitoring, you'll hear that term a lot. Well, we're going to do some progress monitoring. It's really important when you hear that term that you know that's not the intervention. That's just keeping data on how well they're responding to the intervention. But sometimes in these meetings, I'll hear professionals talk about progress monitoring, meaning collecting data as if it is the intervention, and it's not. That is determining, did it work? It's the same thing as if you go to the doctor and they take your blood pressure and you have high blood pressure and your doctor says, you know what, I'm going to put you on some blood pressure medication. I want to see you back, every month for 3 months, and we're going to do some readings of your blood pressure. Those readings are progress monitoring. The medication that he puts you on, that's the intervention. So I know from listening to people talk in IEP meetings, sometimes that is confused with the actual intervention. So just know that the progress monitoring piece is just how are they going to measure the impact of what they're doing? It's not the intervention itself. So once we get that data, now what do? Do we add more time? Do we add a different intervention? Do we scrap the intervention and change it all together? Or at some point, do we refer them for an evaluation because nothing that we have done has worked? That's part of that problem solving process. So what is involved at those levels? Well, at tier 1, when they're looking at universal screening, when teachers are looking at that, and they're looking at how the core instruction goes, and administrators, curriculum strategists, people even at the district level, they're looking at those large scale numbers of how are our kids, for example, with reading, how are our kids responding to this reading curriculum that we implemented for the first grade all across the district? How is that working? So they may engage in professional learning communities. This is whenever your teachers have these PD days, where the kids are out because the teachers have training. A lot of them are engaging in things like this, where they may be looking at the data and they see problem areas and they're training the teachers on how to teach better or to fill in gaps in the curriculum. So that might be something that they're doing. Tier 2, this is where you're engaging with that SBLC, school building level committee, and you have that collaborative team approach. And then tier 3, you are still engaging with the SBLC because you are further refining and intensifying that intervention. So that's what that looks like, those interventions at each one. So like I said, RTI is not a prepackaged program that's all wrapped up in a bow that's supposed to cure everything that ails us. It's not dibbling. Dibbles, if you're familiar with that term, that's just a type of progress monitoring that we do. Those are benchmark, meaning we do them 3 times a year for K through 3. Those are some measurements that we use, but it's not an intervention. It is not an intervention curriculum. It's not one set curriculum. It's the collecting the data, determining the needs, putting strategies in place to respond to those needs, whatever those strategies are, not a single curriculum. It's also not a box to check on the way to special education. And that is really sad because that's kind of what it's become. Not just in our state. We see this nationwide as a problem that people are just like, oh, well, I've got to get some RTI data. I got to do something so I can check that box. So the school psychologist will take the referral packet and evaluate this kid. And that goes back to that faulty mindset of these kids. I say this when I'm speaking about general ed teachers, that these kids aren't our kids. They're not general ed kids. I got to go through this process so I can get them to the special ed teacher because this one is her kid. We have done a lot in professional development over, I would say, at least the past decade to try to change that mindset. But does it still hang on in some areas and some teachers' minds? Yes. I don't know when we're going to get over the hill of thinking about our kids as if they just belong to the special ed teacher. But it's getting better. I will say that there is more ownership in general education over all the kids than I have seen in my career, but we're still not quite there where we fully, truly embrace that and believe that. And, you see that in every corner of education and every general education classroom. We've got work to do on that. RTI is not just a place to send the difficult students either. RTI is a process to get a kid what they need so that they hopefully don't need supports, or they may need they need more supports. It's getting them what they need. IDEA, the 2007 authorization, allows 15% of special education funds to be used for school-wide early pre-referral. We're talking about pre-referral for evaluation, pre-referral interventions to help alleviate learning difficulties for struggling students. They did this because we see that we're putting too many kids in special education for maybe the wrong reasons. Just because you're not performing at the level that we think that you should for your grade level, how can we say, without making sure that the instruction and the intervention that you've gotten is good, how can we say that it's a child problem? How do we know that it's not an instructional problem? Or how do we know that it's not a short-term problem, that maybe for whatever reason this child has some skill gaps in a certain area, and if we can just teach these skills, if we can go back and reteach and fill in those gaps, that they won't need these supports over usually the rest of their lifetime. One of the big areas where RTI is needed for those kids that we are considering specific learning disability, which is about half of who is in special ed. And like I said earlier, I think I actually mentioned that earlier, only 1.8% of students nationally who go into special education end up getting reevaluated and determine that they are general education students again. So even that's something we got to think about, is even though we are putting these kids into special education, it's not a place where necessarily it's going to go save all of these children and it's going to get them, back out to where they don't need supports. When you only have 1.8% of students who are able to come out of it, that's really low. And all of this data came from our U.S. Education Department. So you can look those things up on ed.gov. I put that resource, that link there to that information. Some other problems, some other reason why we need RTI is years ago, whenever this became a requirement in the state of Louisiana, one of the main reasons was because we had an over-identification of African-American students in categories that were kind of stigmatizing, such as emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, and in specific learning disability. We were qualifying way more kids who were African-American than any other racial category. Well, is it that truly that many African-American kids are these things, or was that a cultural competency issue? And I would argue that it is the latter, that it is that maybe there are some adjustments that we need to make to our education practices to make sure that we are culturally competent and that we are teaching all children, regardless of their culture, their race, their ethnicity. We know how to reach these kids. So when you see those large numbers, and there's, matter of fact, decades ago, some of y'all that I know there's some Families Helping Families people on this webinar that have been around a long time. You might even remember there was a big debate about IQ years ago. There was a book that came out called The Bell Curve, and it argued that because African-American people score lower on IQ tests, that in general, African-Americans have a lower IQ. Well, and that was a commonly held belief for quite some time, a false belief, but a commonly held one. And what we learned is, no, that's not exactly true. But some of these tests that we use to measure IQ are culturally biased against minorities. And so if the measurement is faulty, well, then yes, you're going to get a gap between groups if you're not measuring in a way that you can adequately measure all groups when you're asking questions that are not culturally appropriate to all cultures. that's a problem. So not only did we bring about RTI, but in the testing world, in the psychological testing world, we have also had to look at our test instruments. There's been a lot of professional development in the past decade around selecting test instruments that are culturally appropriate for the population that we're using them for. We've also put pressure on the testing companies to make it right, to make edits to these things like IQ test, achievement test, where they take out questions that are not culturally appropriate. I remember on one of the early IQ tests when I first started, I've been doing this for 17 years. One of the early IQ tests had a question on there about sailboats. Well, I started out my career in little old Bienville Parish, Louisiana, landlocked parish in North Louisiana that is full of nothing but pine trees. And there's not a lot of sailboats in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. So are they going to get that question about sailboats? No, that's not culturally appropriate to kids that live in rural areas that are not near the ocean, for example. So we've had to change the way we test. We've had to change the way we select test, things like that. But we've also, because we know there are these problems, we've had to give interventions to make sure we're not labeling a kid because of some cultural reason rather than the fact that that kid has a true disability. So it's been over 10 years ago now, it's been over a decade ago in Louisiana. The districts were required to develop a plan to address these root causes for over-identification. We had to engage in problem solving and figure out why are we calling more African-American kids intellectually disabled or specific learning disability. What is it for our specific population? And we had to come up with a plan to say, this is what we're going to do differently. I remember I was part of it too. It's not just identifying those with disabilities. In my own district, I had to come up with a plan on how I was going to identify more minorities for gifted. So it was even on the other end of the learning spectrum as well. And then also this came about where there was this availability of special education funding could be used for pre-referral for evaluation interventions. So when we engage in RTI, we're trying to identify difficulties earlier. We're trying to intervene effectively. That's a key word there, is doing it effectively. If what we're doing is not working, we got to change what we're doing. And we're trying to solve small problems. I say small, but really it's those earlier learning skills before they become bigger, because we know that these kids' skills, they build upon one another. So the earlier we can start, it's a smaller issue to fill in a little gap. Then it becomes a big problem when we didn't fill in this gap. And now we have this gap on top of it. Now we have these missing skills on top of that. So RTI allows us to help struggling students before they fail. It also allows us to help those students. This is something that I think parents get frustrated with a lot, because in your defense, because the process is not explained very well in these meetings. I mean, I'll take ownership over that for my field. We're coming there and we're really rushed, and maybe we don't go over things very well. And the parent maybe has learned, my kid's not going to get help until they get to special ed. Maybe they have been told this even by the general ed teacher, right? So they think nothing's going to be done until my kid gets to this magical place called special education. And RTI, because it involves that intervention piece, actually it allows us to go ahead and start providing supports earlier on. So they don't have to wait until they get to that magical place of special education. They can get help now. So we don't wait. We want to move away from waiting to fail. We don't want to fail to act instead. We want to use that expertise from the general education teacher, from the special education teacher. Sometimes special education teachers even come in and co-teach, or they help with designing interventions and they support the general education teacher in this process. A lot of SBLC committees across schools in Louisiana include one of the special education teachers on the committee, because they have that expert in interventions. And so we want that collaborative problem solving process to be going on. And we want, what this really means for education is, because now we're doing this thing pre-referral, these are our kids. They're all of our responsibility for ensuring that they adequately learn. They're not just, you're the struggling kid, so you belong to Miss Smith down the hall that teaches special ed. It is a shifting of mindset. So previously, a student had a learning disability if and only if their achievement scores were significantly discrepant, meaning there was a big gap from their cognitive scores. But now students may be identified as disabled if they do not respond to scientifically based, so research-based instruction and intervention that was actually implemented with fidelity. I want you to think about this think about a paper cut. Paper cuts need neosporin. Paper cuts don't need surgery, right? But if we wait long enough, we'll be able to justify that trip to the emergency room because maybe the paper cut becomes infected and we now have gangrene and we got a much bigger problem. Waiting until it's an emergency is not good for students. It's not good for schools. It's not good for the staff time involved. It's not good for education budgets. Waiting to fail is costly in that regard. So now, previously, special education funds could only be used for special education students. But like I said, now up to 15% of those funds can be used to support early intervention efforts. So it's not special ed, it's not general ed, it's just education. Now in Louisiana, in Bulletin 1508, it defines Bulletin 1508. Let me back up for just a minute. This is the law that people like me, school psychologists, your educational diagnosticians, those people that come in and talk to you and they're doing these evaluations with your kid. This is the law that we are guided by. We have to use this law to determine what we do in that evaluation and how we use the information from that evaluation to identify your child as having some sort of qualifying disability. And I want to highlight pieces of it. So that process incorporates increasing intensities of instruction. So increasing the level of instruction. Think about that pyramid I showed you, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And or intervention that are provided to the students in direct proportion to their individual needs. That's part of meeting them where they are at. And you see there, it goes on to say it's also used in decision-making process. So Bulletin 1508 also says you as the parent, you are to be provided with a summary report of how this is working. You shouldn't just find out in August, hey, Houston, we have a problem. We're going to do RTI with your kid. And then you don't hear from them again until April or May. And they say, okay, well, all the things we did didn't work. So here, can you sign this form to have your child evaluated? That is not okay. If your child is undergoing interventions through the RTI process, the law states that you are to be provided with some kind of summary report, whether it's just, hey, here's an update on the data that we're collecting. It's not necessarily a fancy or detailed report, but basically you need to be notified of how things are going every single grading period. A lot of schools, not all, but a lot of schools will have you come in and meet once a month during this process, maybe once every other month, because usually that's a grading period. They are required by law to do that. We're also required to give you a copy of your rights, which includes the right to request an evaluation at any time in this process. You have that right. Why do we have to have RTI? Here's another reason. For a child to qualify for specific learning disability, we actually have to provide interventions that are conducted with fidelity, meaning we really did them. We have data, we have proof that we've done them. Notice here's the ambiguity that frustrates everybody. For the length of time necessary to obtain sufficient data to determine if they're effective. So in the law, one of the reasons where you might hear of your friends' kids in, so-and-so parish, they got RTI for 12 weeks and then they got an evaluation. And maybe you're in this other parish and your kid, they've been doing RTI for a year and a half and they still haven't evaluated. One of the reasons is because of the ambiguity in the language that we follow to do this. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, let's fix that. We can fix that, right? There's a reason for that, because if your child is responding to that intervention, and maybe there's some evidence to say, you know what, if we tweak this aspect or we add this extra intervention, we can reach the goal and get them caught up. We are supposed to continue doing interventions. It would be better to be honest. Remember that 1.8% of those kids that are testing out of special ed back to general ed? It'd be better to leave them in interventions and get them what they need. If that data is showing this is what they need, if the data is showing, that's a key part too. I want you to make sure you hear that. If the data is showing that those interventions is what they need, that they are making progress, then we do leave them in the RTI process rather than refer them for an evaluation. So with specific learning disability, maybe the scientifically research-based intervention outcomes and the standardized testing don't clearly show that there are the criteria to meet the criteria for SLD or specific learning disability, but a preponderance of all the data collected supports the team's position that the child should qualify. So even if they don't come out with those scores that they say that, what is a strength and what is a weakness for SLD, we can still use all of that RTI data. If we feel like that this kid really still needs help, here we have the data to show that we did RTI, we made these changes, we tried all of these different things, and they're still underperforming in the classroom. We can write a justification and explain that child really truly is SLD, and our law allows for that. I will tell you that this is the least used criteria underneath SLD to qualify a kid in the state of Louisiana and beyond, because people feel really uncomfortable with this. People feel uncomfortable with making that call, even because they don't have these set test scores that they would naturally qualify for to show they have a strength or a weakness. And it's not okay. There's this caveat in our law that says we can still go that way. So who is on that SBLC committee? Should be the child's teacher. Usually there's a pupil appraisal member. That might be the school psychologist or an educational diagnostician. It might be a social worker, and there should be an administrator from the school, whether that's the principal or the assistant principal. Other people that are often included, you see there, speech pathologists, lead teachers like curriculum strategists, special education teachers, or other types of interventionists that the school employs. So how much data do you need to determine how many data points do you need to determine if something is really working? Well, our best practice says that you can get a trend in about 3 to 5 data points. So let's say they're collecting data weekly. Within about 3 to 5 weeks or 3 to 5 collections, we can know, is this child's skills going up? Are they staying about the same? Are they going down? We don't want to look at a single point. We want to look at how is the trend over time? What is it saying about their progress? So we'll look at also the rate of growth. So let's say, like I said, that kid is going up. It's trending up. That skill that we're measuring is trending up. But is it doing it at a rate where this kid is ever going to catch up to where their peers are? So we look at what direction is the trend going, but also that rate of growth. Are they growing enough that they're going to catch up with where they need to be? If you have more questions about that, University of Missouri College of Education, there is a researcher there named Matt Burns. He's a school psychologist, and he is one of the leading researchers in this area about how much data do you need to reliably make decisions and things like that. And so that link is to a little bit more information to explain about making data-based decisions. Now, here's something that is really important. If you learn nothing else from what I say to you today as a parent, you see that is hyperlinked there to this Office of the OSEP memo. OSEP is the governing agency. They oversee Office of Special Education Programs. So they oversee the education of what we call diverse learners who have different needs. And they put out this memo in January of 2011. So 12 years ago, this is not new, to tell school districts, yes, we want you to have RTI. However, you can't use that as an excuse to just indefinitely defer evaluating a child. If a parent requests, I recommend, highly recommend, in writing. Email's great because it time and date stamps everything. If you request an evaluation, they cannot come back to you and say, well, we're not going to evaluate because the kid's in RTI. They can't legally do this. And that OSEP memo to districts I want to say it's like 16 to 18 pages long. It's kind of lengthy, and in great detail, it talks about the legality of that, because that is something that you will hear from districts. Why do you hear that from the districts? So I'm going to present you both sides of this coin. Okay. You hear that especially because if we're looking at specific learning disability as a category, we have to have, that's one of the core things to qualify them, is we've got to have some data showing that they did not respond to interventions adequately to catch up to their peers. Now, in other disability categories and behavior, we want to have some data to show we did these interventions and their behavior didn't rectify. But there are things like, for example, vision and hearing impairment. We're not going to intervene the visual impairment out of a kid that has visual impairment. Autism, that is one that I'm going to take a little liberty, Sharon. That one chaps my hide. There is no known intervention that's going to cure the autism out of a kid that has autism. It's very clearly that they have characteristics of autism. There is no reason for you to delay an evaluation for RTI so we can do some interventions for that kid. Another thing that's mentioned in this memo is that interventions and the evaluation can run concurrently, meaning that you can do them at the same time. There's nothing that is preventing that. So if you are having that struggle with your child's school district where they're saying, we can't evaluate, we got to do interventions first, I highly recommend walking in with a copy of this memo and a letter in writing saying, I'm aware that you can do interventions and the evaluation at the same time. And that's what I want done. And you can present this to them so that they know that you're a person that knows your rights. So that is very important. If you take nothing else away from that resource, I want you to have. These are also some other really good reputable resources. Understood.org is a great one. That's the National Center for Learning Disabilities. Rightslaw.org. They even have a sample letter that you can fill out that to request an evaluation. The National Center on RTI, that's a great resource. And all of these, in my opinion, are user-friendly resources that you can comprehend. So I know I've been talking a lot and I do want to leave time for some questions because this is a lot of information kind of probably thrown at you all at once. Sharon, I see some in the chat. Let's see.
Yeah, we've just been chatting away while you were talking. Could you go back to the part that where you talked about who does the interventions? What are the qualifications of the people who implement the intervention?
Okay. And I do see one of the questions are specifically about behavior interventions. That's a great question. While we're on the subject of things that chaps Amber's hide, there is no legal definition in the state of Louisiana, there is a credential through the Louisiana Department of Education for a behavior interventionist, and it is very vague. It's not good. It is something that school psychologists, something that we have advocated for there to be better clarification around who can get that credential and who is really equipped. Right now, if you are, for example, a social worker, if you're a counselor, you're a school psychologist, you should have the skills to do that. However, you've got some people in districts who were maybe they were teachers that really did really well with these kids. And they say, well, you did good with the ones that you had in your classroom, so we're going to make you the behavior interventionist. And the most recent district that I worked in before I came here actually to work at ULM, we had a district behavior interventionist that was just a teacher with a bachelor's degree well, I will say he was fabulous with those kids and de-escalation techniques and things like that. But as far as designing interventions for the kids, like how should the teacher respond when the student does this behavior, you need people who are trained in mental and behavioral health to come up with the all day, right? The systematic intervention that's going to be put in place by those people that are directly working with the child throughout the day. So there are some problems around that. For academic interventions, it should be the child's general education teacher. That's, like I said, RTI is not a special ed function. It is a general ed function because it is pre-evaluation referral, or it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be something to shift that mindset and make the general education providers take ownership. Now, I will say a lot of kids, we've sometimes used the speech pathologist. They are fantastic at working on language skills. So we may use them to do some early intervening services, and they can do some interventions with kids before they are identified and legally qualified underneath an IEP to receive speech language services, and they do an excellent job. So that's one area. It might be a school psychologist, it might be a general education teacher. In some schools, they will use the special education teacher. I don't advocate for that, because I advocate for them to be used as a consultant for the general ed teacher, but I think that perpetuates that mindset that, oh, he's her kid, that he belongs to special ed, he or she. Always pick on boys, but girls go into special education too. That just perpetuates that mindset. So it's really supposed to be, it may be a team-based approach, but at the core, it should be the general education teacher or someone that's like a curriculum strategist, still a certified teacher. But it really depends on what the problem is that they are addressing. When it comes to behavior, I would advocate that you want your school psychologist, your school social worker, or a licensed counselor. You want some kind of credentialed person that is assisting in the development of that intervention. I hope that answered that question.
Does that change from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3? The person who's doing it? I know tier 1 would be the general ed teacher, and maybe tier 2, but tier 3 becomes a different situation, right?
It can change. Usually tier 2, you're bringing in extra personnel, maybe at least in a consultative manner at that time. That's why you're bringing in the SBLC, all those different people that are on the SBLC committee. That's a problem solving team. That's what that team is all about. So for example, my 15 years of full-time practice that I was in, I was on every one of my schools that I was assigned to, I was on their SBLC committee. So I might be there as a consultant to help a teacher select a reading intervention or design a behavioral strategy, things like that. But I might not be the one directly delivering the service. It's probably going to be the general education teacher. But it can change. There should be more, at the very least, there should be more collaboration with people with different expertise around the problem as you move through those tiers. Does that help?
And is the parent a part of the SBLC team? Do they bring the parent in?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you, as somebody that does behavioral intervention, I can only do so much in the school system if, in some cases, if the same strategies are not being reinforced at home. So like, for example, we're dealing with a kid that has anger management issues, okay, or self-regulation. And we come up with, I'll use my own child as an example. He had a lot of difficulty in elementary school. He had to have a behavior plan because of his own self-regulation, right? He was heavily involved in Minecraft at this time. Well, we came up with these cards that he could use to show what his emotion was at that time and communicate. So we knew if he used, there was one of the Minecraft characters that was on fire. If he used that when he was about to blow his top and that he needed a break, So he had an individualized behavior plan, where the school psychologist, not me, but they came in and they helped design that plan. But everybody that was a part of it had to be aware of those cues. Well, guess what? Even at home, because we knew that this is the language, the pictures are his language of what he's using to identify emotions. Me and his dad started using them at home too. So he could use his picture cards if something was upsetting him, or he needed to take a break, or he wasn't feeling well. We would honor that. They actually were on a ring on his backpack. So they came to school and home with him. So that's an example of how the family can be involved and support the intervention, because we know that he's going to learn how to use that a lot faster and a lot better if everybody that works with him is taking part in it. Does that make sense?
Yes. The initial question, and this was Bridget that asked that question about the who the professionals were, who were doing the intervention. But this is the story. Her 7-year-old daughter is autistic, and they've asked the school for an autism evaluation. She says, when we met with the school, they said that she needs to go through several interventions, including a behavioral intervention, before they would consider evaluating her. And this is with an autism diagnosis, medical diagnosis. We do not find this requirement neuroaffirming. What are our options? She is in need of support and accommodations now. Is that even legal?
No,
You answered a
it's
lot of
not
that.
legal for them to deny the evaluation. Just that piece of that story, that is illegal. They cannot deny. If you have asked for an evaluation for your child, there is evidence there that there are some behaviors that are characteristic of autism, and they're impacting her ability to fully function in the educational setting. They can't legally deny doing that evaluation. And this is why I hyperlink that OSEP letter, because, and whenever working through the Autism Society with parents as well, I share that link a lot with parents, because you're not going to intervene all the autism out of the kid. Or can you alleviate some struggles that they have? For example, you might do social skills, or there might be some behavioral training. Of course, you do want it to be neuroaffirming and not ableist, but there might be some interventions. For example, my son, he wanted to make friends. That was a goal of his. Is he actually was motivated, but he didn't know how to walk up to a kid and make, do you want to be my friend? His way of doing that is to walk up to you and start, launch into a detailed explanation about dark matter and how stars implode. And in the middle of that explanation, by the way, there was no lead up to it. Well, that's not going to make friends, they're going to kind of look at you like, eh. So there are interventions that you can do. This is a skill that you want to learn. This would help you get along with your peers in your educational environment. We can teach you some social skills around making friends for an elementary age child. Those kind of things can be done, but you know what? They can be done at the same time of the evaluation, because autism definitely is one where there is no point in waiting. There's just really no point in doing that. Well, another thing that could be done in the meantime to go ahead and get some accommodations in place. So RTI, those are interventions. I should add this as a slide, Sharon, before I present this again. Those are interventions. Those are extra things that we're doing to teach a skill. There is a difference between interventions and accommodations. An accommodation is saying, for example, if we know that a kid is dyslexic, then we add an accommodation that their materials can be read to them so they can still hear their materials. Now, does reading those materials to them, is that really teaching them reading? No, that's an accommodation. Intervention is trying to grow the skill. Accommodation, think of it as your leg is broken, so we're going to give you a pair of crutches to help you still get around and access your environment. And there's a difference. They can do 504 in the meantime while they're working on an evaluation or completing an evaluation. There's nothing that stops them from considering doing Section 504 accommodations, which a 504 plan can get you some of those accommodations. So that's something to ask for, to not delay getting some help in the process.
Well, I misspoke. She does not have a medical diagnosis, but Bridget is autistic and she has other autistic children as well. So, I mean, they pretty much know autism, and they
mean,
know that she has autism.
Yeah. Who is the expert in the room? Probably,
Exactly.
probably the one where it lives at her house. And so, don't know that. Like if I can speak anything into you, I'm hoping I'm speaking confidence that you can go in there and ask for these things that it lives at your house, that this is what your kid needs.
Right. Bridget, if you need to open your mic and ask any further questions, you're welcome to do that. And anyone, if you have a question that you would like addressed, please feel free to jump in. You can open your mic or you can type it into the chat box.
And if you have a question even after the fact that maybe you didn't feel comfortable asking, with everybody in the Zoom room, that's okay too. My email is up there and I'm happy to field questions that way as well.
I'm also dropping the link in the chat box for the little survey that I asked you to complete. So while we're listening to questions, please click on that link for me and give us some feedback on today. This has been incredible, Dr. Harris. Thank you so much.
I'm glad to do it.
I mean, it's obvious that you have expertise from all sides of the desk, so we appreciate that.
That's actually my presentation I do for professionals. I call it tales from both sides of the conference table. Because you just, I've ran into meetings before. I don't have much time. I got to go over these results because I got to drive 30 miles to get to my other school and go to another meeting and zoom through things and use a lot of acronyms and lingo. And then I had my own child go through this process,
Right.
and it definitely has impacted the way that I practice. So I appreciate everything that you do at Families Helping Families and that y'all facilitate these trainings. If I can plug you or compliment you just one more time, that when my son did get diagnosed, he was about 4 years old, and I had to go through my own process of processing that information. And it changes things when you're a parent, not just a professional. And I went to, I was able to go to the state Lessard conference because of a grant that was provided through Families Helping Families.
Wow.
Y'all paid for my registration and my travel for me to be able to go. And at the time, Garrison was on so many therapies and all the copays, and, finances were tight. And so I would not have been able to go to that conference if it was not for that parent training grant through Families Helping Families. So I find it really hard whenever Mary Jacobs or Sharon Blackman ask me to do something. I can't say no. I got to give back. So because that was life-changing for me in just processing everything with my son, and to be able to go and surround myself with adults that have autism and see that end of that aspect of life when you're an adult. And it was really life-changing for me as a parent to be able to do that. So,
well, it's interesting you mentioned Lessard. We have 2 Lessard presentations coming up in the spring.
Awesome.
In February, we have a team from Lessard that's going to be presenting on behavior issues. I'm not sure exactly the specifics yet. And then in March, a team will be talking about communication issues. Okay. So that's specifically with autism, but it certainly applies to a lot of other folks. This presentation has been recorded, and it will be on our YouTube channel, which will be linked to our website. So keep an eye on our website. It'll be up by next week. So, Dr. Harris, we thank you so much. Thanks for going over a little bit. I know that your time is tight, but we just really appreciate your relaxed demeanor and your interest in answering specific questions. Your expertise is obvious, and we really appreciate you very much.
Thank y'all so much.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.